go ahead and get started. So welcome everybody. I'm Cliff Lynch, the director of the Coalition for Networked Information. I'll be introducing this session today. You've reached the final session for the first day of the synchronous briefings for the 2021 spring virtual CNI member meeting. And it's great to have you here with us. I'll just remind you that we will be having additional synchronous project briefings during various times for this week. And next week, we will do a couple of days of plenary sessions to close out the meeting. For the spring meeting, we're relying more heavily on pre-recorded project briefings. And I just want to remind you that as part of the meeting opening today, we did release quite a number of pre-recorded project briefings that are available on demand. I think you'll find there's a rich assortment of material in there. So please look through that when you have the opportunity. This session is being recorded and the recording will be publicly available subsequent to the meeting. Just a couple of mechanical things. We have got a chat window and please feel free to use that to make comments, introduce yourself, etc. There is also a Q&A tool at the bottom of your screen. At any point during the presentation, if questions occur to you, please feel free to put those in the Q&A tool. And we will address all of the questions at the end after we've been through the presentations. It's also possible during the Q&A to raise your hand and we can turn on your microphone so that you can ask questions by voice if it's a more involved question and you prefer to do that. And I think that's all the mechanical sorts of things I need to say. We have quite a panel today, and Heather Staines, who is going to be kind of running the panel, will introduce everybody in a moment. I just want to first off thank Heather and all of the panelists for putting this session together. It's really interesting and a very timely topic. This whole issue of social learning and how that can contribute to things like close reading has become an extremely intriguing topic that's opened up in the last year or two. At the last hypothesis meeting that happened in person that I was able to attend, which I guess was 2019. Time has gotten so strange since the pandemic. There were a series of fascinating presentations where we had a number of faculty who taught literary analysis, writing, and things like that, talking about how class annotation was an incredibly powerful tool for enhancing student learning and engagement. And you know, I guess I sort of see what we're going to hear about today as perhaps the next logical step at taking that to a much broader scale. So I'm really delighted that Heather and her colleagues can join us. Heather will introduce all the rest of the folks on the panel. And at this point, I'll just say thank you for joining us. My thanks again to the panelists. And I'll shut up, go away, and turn it over to Heather.
Thanks so much, Cliff. I'm really excited to be here today. This is my first CNI meeting. So thanks to Cliff for inviting us to do the project briefing, and to Diane for helping us with the behind the scenes logistics. As was mentioned previously, we're using a Zoom webinar format, so I don't believe you guys can see each other, but the secret is the chat box is open to everyone. So if you'd like to introduce yourself, maybe explain a little bit about why this session was attractive to you, what your interests are in social learning. That way you can see what others have found of interest here, and know, really who's out there in the ether. And then we'll have the questions at the end. So first, we're going to hear from Dan Whaley. Dan is the founder and CEO for Hypothesis, where I used to work. Oh, I should say I'm Heather Staines, and I'm currently an independent consultant. I'm remiss if I didn't say that. Dan's from Hypothesis. Dan is a coder and entrepreneur. He created the first online travel reservation company on the web called Get There in 1995. He wrote much of the software, launched the business, and guided the long-term technical and product vision. Get There went public in 1999 and was sold to Sabre in 2000 with nearly 600 employees, while processing approximately 50% of travel transacted online. Dan currently serves as a director of Sauce Labs, a leading open source functional testing company, and Get Around, a peer-to-peer car sharing company. He's a Shuttleworth Fellow. After Dan, we will hear from Hugh McGuire. Hugh McGuire is the CEO. He's the co-founder of the Rebus Foundation. He's been building tools and communities to bring books into the open web since about 2005. He's the founder of LibriVox.org, which is free public domain audiobooks made by volunteers from around the world, and Pressbooks, which is an open source book publishing platform. I should go to the next slide with the names on it. There we go. Built on WordPress. Along with Brian O'Leary, Hugh is the co-editor of the book called Book, A Futurist Manifesto, Essays from the Bleeding Edge of Publishing. I'm sure there's lots of folks who'd be interested in that. Next up will be Remi Kalir. Remi is an assistant professor of learning design and technology at the University of Colorado Denver School of Education and Human Development. He researches how social annotation facilitates collaborative, open, and equitable learning. During the 2020-2021 academic year, Kalir is serving, I should say Remi is serving, as Hypothesis's inaugural scholar in residence, and is helping to lead a new research initiative related to social annotation and student learning. He is also the lead author of a forthcoming book called Annotation, a volume in the MIT Press Essential Knowledge series. He's co-founder and facilitator of Marginal Syllabus, that I hope some of you are aware of already, a research practice partnership that sparks and sustains conversation about educational equity through social annotation. He earned his PhD in curriculum and instruction from the University of Wisconsin at Madison. And finally, rounding out our panel today will be Mark Graham. Mark Graham's created and managed innovative online products and services since 1984. As director of the Wayback Machine at the Internet Archive, Mark is responsible for capturing, preserving, and helping people discover and use more than 1 billion new web catchers each week. And that's billion with a B. Mark was most recently senior vice president with NBC News, where he managed several business units, including Garden Web and Stringwire. He was senior vice president of technology with iVillage, an early internet company that focused on women and community. And he co-founded Roho Networks, one of the first large-scale feed aggregators and personalized blog readers. Mark's early training and experience with computer-mediated communications was acquired when he served in the U.S. Air Force, spending more than 3 years working at the Air Force Data Services Center at the Pentagon. Mark's nonprofit work includes volunteering with the Open Educational Library, oercommons.org, and he's a board member also of openrecoverysf.org. And with that, I will hand it over to Dan to kick us off.
Thanks, Heather. Hey, everybody. Nice to see you all here. And thanks for coming. We'll give you a little bit of background on what we're thinking about, and then let Remi and Hugh and Mark dive a little bit into kind of how they see the context and role of this from their different perspectives in scholarship and publishing and archiving. And also, I wanted to say that we're going to be talking about an initiative here. The primary feedback is to give you a little bit of information about this, but most importantly, to solicit your feedback and your input about how you see this, what you think, what do you think about it, what maybe we should consider, what we might be missing, who else we should be reaching out to, and how this may relate to your work in libraries and so forth. So the context of this is that, and this ultimately came from a problem that we were seeing at Hypothesis and with other platforms kind of like ourselves. We're trying to bring interactivity to the classroom experience, and doing that in most of the time in a LMS authenticated way inside platforms. And the goal in order to keep students engaged, make better use of the classroom time, leverage peer learning as where students help each other. And that bringing this activity to these platforms requires connection to the material, and in the texts that make up that material. Next slide. And so the problem, though, is that because we're sitting inside this LMS authenticated experience most of the time, sometimes things like our Hypothesis are used outside the LMS. There are plenty of instructors out there who, prefer not to use the LMS, and which is just fine with us. You can, also use Annotation in a way that's outside that framework. But at least well over 90% of the folks that are using this are using it kind of within that context. And as it becomes more popular, we expect that percentage will probably increase, because the folks that tend to be outside tend to be the early adopters, and whereas the folks that are inside tend to be a little bit more of the mainstream adopters. So right now, tools like ours can use on texts that are inside the LMS, or stored as PDFs, Google Drive, Box, etc., or in just on the open web, in HTML, web pages, etc. But when it comes to texts that are stored inside external platforms, number one, on reading platforms that are apps themselves, like Vital Source and so forth, or inside authenticated experiences where they might be IP range limited, or in some way need to be logged into that system to be able to gain access to those texts. Then the third-party tool can't, and that authenticated classroom experience, inside the LMS, can't be brought over that third-party tool, that third-party experience, or that remote context platform. And so the downside for instructors and teachers and so forth is that experience that they're having over text, like PDFs that are stored inside Canvas, can't be brought over the platforms that are external to the system. And so what happens most of the time is that the teachers just simply take that third-party content, download it as a PDF, and re-upload it into Canvas, which is a problem in a couple of ways. Number one, it's just kind of a poor user experience. It's a lot of friction. It's an extra step, but also a lot of times it's a violation of whatever kind of license requirement that they might have with that third-party agreement. Now, generally speaking, this is a widespread practice that's going on already. Teachers are downloading texts and uploading them into these systems, and I think generally folks either consider it to be fair use, or they kind of look the other way. But as this practice of social learning and peer learning becomes more mainstream, and this becomes more of something, particularly if annotation or these kind of things are required as part of the grade, then, and the option to use the the print or the other text is not an option because the interactive experience over the digital text is required, then having something that is integrated with all the platforms that the text might be on becomes more and more important. So we asked ourselves, how could we solve for this problem? Not just for ourselves, but for other third-party applications like ourselves. Next slide. Just, kind of from our perspective, the the landscape of platforms that are out there kind of falls into these categories. There's the LMS itself, the aggregators, the EBSCOs and the ProQuests and so forth, OER materials, the actual publishers, archives like JSTOR and Internet Archive and so forth, the digital distributors, textbook distributors in particular, like VitalSource and RedShelf, local PDFs that might be stored in a drive or a box instance, the open web, of course, as Brian is suggesting, having annotating content on the open web, which is a major use case. And then other kinds of scholarly materials like preprints of journals, self-publishing, like Hugh's folks that are using Pressbooks to publish their own materials, and then e-readers like Kobo and Amazon. And most of these represent, except for the LMS themselves and for maybe the local PDF or the website category, are materials often which are opaque to the third-party tools that, like Hypothesis, that are being used. Next slide. And so what we wondered is, could we bring a coalition of platforms together to work to address the, identify what the obstacles are to more seamless integration of content with interaction, find ways to eliminate those obstacles, potentially in some instances natively integrate the third-party technologies, but at a minimum, not to obstruct them by, in terms of the way that the content is offered or rendered, or sometimes it's not even selectable with your cursor, and there's all kinds of kind of inherent limitations. And would that coalition work in the open in terms of collaborating to solve these things? Next slide. So we have begun to have a wide range of conversations with many of these platforms. Heather has been helping us drive that experience, or drive those conversations. They've gone, I think, fairly well. And the main ask that we've kind of established the context and the landscape here, the main ask that we've had of them is, would you join this coalition? Do you kind of agree with the vision? Would you work to figure out what this would mean in your own platforms? Work and prioritize the effort to remove some of the obstacles that are there, collaborate with others, and be public about that. So the work of the coalition would be focused on a set of technical recommendations for coalition members or others to achieve this kind of interoperability narrative, produce initial demonstrations of this, what it looks like, and then see if the recommendations can be incorporated, if necessary, into other standards frameworks like LDI and so forth. So that's the basic background. And I don't know how we want to run this. We have these basic questions. These are the ones I kind of suggested at the beginning. What do you think about this? What should we be thinking about here? How can you see any benefits to this, kind of in your own worlds? What are the issues that you see, and who else should we be talking to? We can either.
I think, Dan, it's best if we hold the questions till the
Great.
end, because I think the speakers are all going to, kind of play off each other. And you can go ahead and put a question, if you haven't now, into the Q&A. We can all see that. Or you can hang on until the end and raise your hand, and you will be unmuted. So let me go ahead and hand over to Hugh.
Hello, and I'm Hugh. I have to update that picture. I used to find it strange that people with gray hair in their beards showed pictures from many years ago, and now I'm doing that just because I haven't updated this in however many years. But anyway, I'm Hugh. Very happy to be here, particularly with Hypothesis, which I think has been doing so much cool stuff for the web for a long time, and as well as the Internet Archive, which has kind of inspired a lot of my journey in the universe, thinking about universal access to all human knowledge. Next slide, Heather. So quickly, what is Pressbooks? We are a open source bookmaking platform. That's how we started, with the idea that Pressbooks could help different models of publishing emerge. And we've been adopted largely in the EDU universe. We work with about 150 educational institutions around North America mainly. And Pressbooks is used to create, adapt, and share educational material, largely OER, so open educational resources. We have a new thing that I'll talk about a little bit here in the context of social learning, which is the directory, which allows you to search and use a lot of these books that are public within the Pressbooks ecosystem. And what we are mainly known for is our authoring and editing platform that allows you to author or adapt content with a full toolbox of features. And one of those part of that full toolbox is native integration with Hypothesis out of the box. Next slide. I want to talk a bit about the directory. It's a new thing we've just rolled out, and I thought in the context of social education, it was important to take not just as that annotation layer, but the idea of what do we do with text. And the directory, Pressbooks has been around for a while, but the directory is the first time where we've made it easy to surface and find texts that have been created on the Pressbooks platform, that if you've got access to Pressbooks, you can pull into your own system if they're openly licensed and make adaptations yourself. And this is trying to solve this question of how do we find good OER from other institutions? What are some good quality OER? How do we extend the reach of great stuff? And how can we get started with existing OER to build upon? Next slide. So there's this growing community of OER practitioners. And I think, again, it's interesting to think about OER in the context of being a great tool to start building these ideas on, where it's a lot easier to work with content that's in the open and educational content that's in the open for the challenges that Dan outlined at the beginning. And we work with Hypothesis, but for instance, this question, we have our own LTI integration tool into the LMS, but it doesn't play with Hypothesis's, is that how you say that? Hypothesis's LTI integration. So how do we who are operating in this space, we're probably a good starting place to start building some of these tools. But how do we collaborate not just on content, but how do we start thinking about the infrastructure for this content to flow properly and these kind of interactions to flow properly? Next slide. Yeah, and I think what's interesting about this new directory is that it's this always updated index of good quality OER textbooks built on an open source platform, where we can start thinking about how to, you know, as this becomes exposed to more places, how do we think about these items as really social objects that are part of the web that can be built on and used in different ways. And again, what's that infrastructure layer that higher ed needs to be thinking about beyond just the closed platforms that we know are there, and how do we build on this infrastructure? Next slide, please, Heather. And I think that, yeah, for us, this directory was an easy way to help get more of this content out there so that it's more exposed, makes it easier for people to find the stuff that they might want to be adapting. And this brings up issues about metadata, about making sure that the stuff people are producing is findable. And I think back to when we're thinking about metadata conversations I had with John Udell probably multiple years ago, but talking about if we have multiple versions of the same text living in the web, or slightly adapted versions, and you have an annotation layer from Hypothesis on one of those texts, how is it reflected across to another version of that text somewhere else? Hard problem, super interesting, and excited about a universe that's evolving that wants to solve that problem more. Next slide, please, Heather. Yeah, and I think, again, just going back to broadening the idea of what we mean by social education, for us, OER is interesting. Because you can build on texts as they are. So there's the social part, which is the annotation layer, but there's also the modification and the changing existing text, which is a big part of why people like Pressbooks, directory making that easier. But that starts introducing, again, a complicated question about how you're, if you want to be annotating and seeing this in across the web for different versions of the same text, what does that look like? And next slide. Just going back to the directory again, so we index all these Pressbooks networks that are sort of independent publishing entities at the different higher ed institutions. We're just now indexing all of those together, and then pulling all the metadata that's collected into one single place, and you can search and sort using a variety of faceted searches. And next slide, Heather. So there are some of the examples, and there's a link if you want to play around with the directory and see what's there. You could do a quick check to see how many of them have Hypothesis enabled. And we're still in early days, so this is not quite a first cut, but we are evolving this platform, and it's exciting to see, actually, even for us, for the first time, to have a clear view on what's being produced and how much activity there is. Next slide. And that's it. So thank you all.
Thanks, Hugh. And we will be adding this presentation to Sketch. And also, as soon as I'm not screen sharing, I will make sure that a link of it gets put into the chat. And next, we will hear from Remi.
Well, again, it's a pleasure to connect with everyone. Thank you so much for joining our session. As was mentioned in our introductions, my name is Remi Kalir, and this year I'm serving as a scholar in residence at Hypothesis. And so with my commentary today, I'd like to help define social learning and really position social annotation as a use case through which we can understand the various qualities of social learning and make an argument for why this matters for educators and for students. And so we'll use, of course, Hypothesis as an example. And I've put together a pretty simple slide here, but I want to unpack it in detail, which is that social annotation, of course, builds upon annotation as an everyday literacy practice. And so we see across disciplines and certainly across institutional types, as well as grade levels, the ways in which students with their teachers, with a variety of course content, engage with these texts as discursive texts for social learning. And so the question then becomes, what does that look like? And what does that look like in practice? What does the research show us about this type of learning? You know, when Dan was introducing his comments a few moments ago, he actually mentioned some friction that both educators and students may encounter, particularly as learners perhaps move into something like a learning management system, and some of the even kind of like pedagogical workarounds that educators need to creatively employ to make perhaps their content more available to students. And of course, reducing that kind of friction and creating, again, a more seamless and interoperable experience is of course very important for educators and for students. And again, looking at the social annotation literature, we can see why creating these types of seamless social learning experiences matter. And they matter, one, because disciplinary engagement and really deep disciplinary engagement is possible through social annotation. And this can happen in a variety of ways. One, with more experts sharing their knowledge, their terminology, their key concepts with groups of learners. And a lot has been gleaned from, again, the research literature about the ways in which learners benefit from reading expert annotation. And again, we see that both in the natural sciences as well as in the humanities and the social sciences. But a lot of disciplinary engagement also arises through peer-to-peer learning. And again, the social aspects of students raising questions with their peers having those questions answered and moving into more, again, type of deep reading and interpretive practices that even Clifford mentioned at the beginning of his introduction today. We also know that as students engage with texts through annotation and engage in these types of social participatory practices, they construct new knowledge. And there's some very exciting research, including some that Hypothesis is helping to lead right now, that is looking at the ways in which knowledge construction activities, including elaboration, interpretation, disagreement, conflict, as well as consensus building, are all possible through this type, again, of learning experience. And again, reducing students' friction around their engagement with peers and texts and their educators is going to, again, more beneficially contribute to the ways in which knowledge is constructed in these types of classroom experiences. Social annotation is, of course, a form of collaborative dialogue, and it's important to understand that there is, of course, someone might call a genre of online learning associated with things like the discussion forum, and then ways in which the so-called dreaded threaded discussion is a kind of staple, particularly in higher education. And notably, social annotation is working really to kind of break free from that model and showcase a different way in which digital discourse and collaborative dialogue occurs in context, and again, turning texts into discursive contexts where multiple people can take more nuanced views of sharing their knowledge and expertise with one another. And that leads to a fourth and important affordance of social annotation, which is, of course, shared meaning making. And of course, we want, particularly in educational contexts, learners to make meaning of what they are reading, again, across disciplines. And social annotation is a key way to enable that type of shared meaning making in formal educational contexts. So I want to keep my comments brief today, only because I hope that this elicits conversation with this entire panel, as well as everyone attending the webinar, about the ways in which we can understand social annotation as a venue for exploring the full kind of potential of social learning. The last thing I'll just mention very briefly is at the bottom of this slide, there is a link to a public curated bibliography of scholarship specific to social annotation, and more particular, the technology of Hypothesis, which is the most researched social annotation technology ever created. And I think that that speaks volumes to both the technical capabilities of the Hypothesis tool, as well as, of course, the leadership, by the organization, as Dan was speaking to a few moments ago, really leading the charge to create the kinds of open and interoperable learning technologies that create these types of rich learning experiences.
Thanks so much, Remi. And I believe this may be our last slide. Yes, so I will happily get out of the present mode. Give me 1 second. And hand it over to Mark. And then after Mark is finished, we'll open the floor for discussion. Take it away, Mark.
Great, thank you very much. And I'm just going to drop, there we go, some URLs into the chat over there. So first of all, I'm happy to share that the Internet Archive is the latest member, I think maybe, of this coalition for social learning engagement as of the end of last week. And also, I think I was the last person at this panel. So I don't have any slides, but I do have a few comments. I'm going to keep them brief. First of all, the Internet Archive has been involved for a long time in helping to open up access to learning materials in general. We do this in a variety of ways. We have a project called Turn All References Blue. The goal basically is to acknowledge that everything that any human has ever created in written or video, audio format should be accessible to people, which means it should be digitized and available via the net. And any references to those materials that may exist in other formats, say a Wikipedia article or a web page or a book, should have within that a link to the actual resource. So the Turn All References Blue project has been working with Wikipedia sites. Now we have software running on more than 70 language Wikipedia sites to add links to references to books. And we've added about 800,000 links to books in the last few months, to websites, web pages that have gone bad, returned to 404. We've fixed about 14 million of them. And now with the launch last week of scholar.archive.org, which is a platform for open publications, academic publications, we're going to be accelerating our effort to add links to academic papers as well. The idea of turn a reference as blue, it implies that the reference itself is accessible, which maybe is obvious, but in many cases it isn't. I see Mark Miller asked the question about making the resources of libraries available, generally speaking. And the first step there is that the materials within the libraries need to be accessible. They need to be in a digital format. To that end, we have a project called Controlled Digital Lending to extend the role of a library in the digital age. The basic concept is that if a library owns a physical copy of a book, that it can lend out digital versions of that book one at a time, equal to the number of paper copies that the library owns, with controlled digital lending. So I put a link in the chat here. Actually, it's a recent link for a myth-busting session that we did about controlled digital lending, because as some of you probably know, the Internet Archive is being sued by the major publishers about this now. I also just want to note, I'm in the offices right now of ISKME, iskme.org, and they run OER Commons. OER Commons is a leading platform directory for open educational resources, and I'm an advisor to that project. It has currently cataloged hundreds of thousands of educational resources. It's more than 10 years old, and is a leading player in the space of making educational resources available in a variety of different formats. And I'll just finally end that I also put a link up to work we did around the Mueller report. That's probably the closest that we did around annotation. In full disclosure, the Internet Archive is not yet adopted an annotation platform in the classic sense like Hypothesis. We do, however, support many annotation activities. One example was acknowledging when the Mueller report first came out, there were more than 2,000 footnotes in it, but only about 14 of them were links. And so we had a project to identify the resources that were referenced in the Mueller report through these footnotes. In some cases, get the version of them that wasn't online, make it available online, and then work with Digital Public Library of America to produce an updated EPUB version of the Mueller report with more than 700 active web links in it. So we take a very holistic view to information access in general, and to annotation in the sense that things that should be linked are linked, and things that should be accessible are made accessible through those links. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Mark. And remember, if you would like to ask your question, you can either put it in the Q&A or you can raise your hand and someone will unmute you. I've got a couple questions. I always do. Dan, I know one of the things that you've mentioned as really being key to this discussion that you'd like the coalition to undertake are the role of interoperability and standards. Could you tell us just a little bit more about that side of this?
Yeah, I think the key problem that we have now is that the kind of experience that a teacher or student might have in one place is not equivalent to the experience that they can have in the other place. Just at the most basic level, there might be one kind of annotation experience here, and then the platform has its own, but they can't take notes in both and have them searchable, or have the same discussion, in the class in one place as they can in the other. So the first thing that we're trying to do is see, what would it take to create a framework for that kind of interoperability, and also that the underlying technology that might be based on standards, with open APIs and so forth, so that the high quality kinds of experiences and that the data itself is not locked away in proprietary formats.
Mm-hmm. Thanks for that. I want to ask Remi, now you were using social annotation long before many people were forced off campus and into the virtual classroom exclusively. So I would imagine it might have been a little bit more straightforward, at least in one aspect, to move those discussions entirely online. Can you talk a little bit about the strategies that you found effective for social learning, so that others might kind of learn a little bit from that.
Absolutely. And apologies for the little one who may be screaming in the background right now as we all work from home, most of us at least. I think that we can look at this from the perspective of both, a teacher and also a student. A lot of educators now are talking about two topics when it comes to social annotation. One is how educators seed, SEED, their expertise into texts, identifying, again, key terminology, the ways in which researchers describe their methods, asking questions of students to then elicit their responses. And there's been a lot of discussion recently, some anecdotal, some now appearing in the scholarly record, about the ways in which instructors are making these kind of moves within the text, again, as the discursive context. Something else that a lot of educators are currently experimenting with, particularly given the shift to fully online learning, again, pretty much across higher education during the pandemic, has been what we may call orchestration, to use the kind of technical learning sciences jargon. How do social annotation activities sequence with, align to, and then perhaps complement other kinds of classroom activities? Is social annotation a pre-reading activity that then precedes a lecture from a faculty member? Is social annotation done to review course materials? Is it done as a peer review activity among students? And how do these social annotation activities then dovetail to and also extend other kinds of course specific activities? And there's a lot to be learned there. Again, that kind of richens and kind of deepens the kind of overall peer-to-peer learning experiences within either on the ground or certainly online classrooms. And then, Heather, briefly to the point then of what do students do and how do they approach this? I'm increasingly speaking with educators who mention the importance of students having a lot of agency and ownership in the margins, and that these kind of marginal discursive spaces are an important place for students to make their thinking visible, share rough draft thinking, elicit feedback from their peers to clarify misconceptions, and that there's an importance to opening up these margins as really a kind of space for exploratory, again, kind of first draft thinking through often difficult course content. And so having the kinds of interoperable experiences, again, that Dan and others have spoken to now, to make that just easier for students from a technical perspective will be so important as they then move across multiple classes, multiple years of their scholarly journey, and then can take those notes and can kind of take that record of collective intelligence with them over time.
Thanks so much. And Dan has included in the chat, again, some of the questions that he had on his slides. So we'd love to get your reaction from the audience, whether that's as a written reaction or whether you'd like to actually speak with us to some of those questions in the chat box. Anybody want to take a crack at it?
I just want to put a plug in for the value of open standards and the importance of it vis-a-vis long-term sustainability. I think we all recognize that individual companies and projects and priorities, they shift and sometimes go away completely. And there's been many examples of that, actually, even in the annotation world. We remember that YouTube had a very robust annotation system, which they took down. They eliminated it. And there's many other examples that I could list here, but the point is, if annotation systems and these metadata data about data is accessible both in a standard format as well as through some sort of an open standards-based access method, then the probability that those systems are going to be replicated, they're going to be widely adopted and be archived in a way that they could then be reused in a different context is increased. And so certainly it makes my job here at the Internet Archive easier to the degree that these materials are available in open standards. And that's something that it's almost any system that we would adopt and use within the Internet Archive, it would be a requirement for us, actually, that they be standards-based. So we welcome the the leadership with Hypothesis in particular in this. And I'll just put a plug in to say I've been going to the Hypothesis face-to-face conferences for many years now, and even though we've never have not yet formally adopted the hypothesis platform, it certainly influenced some of our priorities and thinking at the Internet Archive to have the benefit of the sharing within that community, which itself is an expression of openness, I think, the spirit in which those conferences have been held over the years.
Yeah, I think that Annotate is coming up in June.
Yep.
Save the date has gone out. I have a question for Hugh. Hugh has his camera off, so I'm hoping that he's actually still there. There he is.
Of course I am, Heather.
Yeah, so I'm really interested in open educational resources, and given that Mark's sitting in the home of OER Commons, I think it's even more valuable. And just to highlight the point that social learning is not just students. Social learning is across instructors who work in the same discipline or who work in an interdisciplinary manner, and having the different versions of OER texts connect to each other and be discoverable and shareable. Can you talk a bit about how that contributes to social learning amongst the faculty set?
Yeah, I guess I can talk about it as well from my context. So I'm the CEO at Pressbooks, also executive director at the Rebus Foundation, which does a lot of work helping groups of OER authors work together. So I think for me, what's interesting again is just zooming out. There is the annotation layer and the way that encourages socialness, but what we've seen in Pressbooks land and Rebus land is that power of people working together from different places on creating content or adapting it and pulling apart and building it in new kinds of ways. And I see that, to me, is such an exciting part of the future of educational content, is the way we can start thinking about content as something that is not just a final monolith end output, but something that can be chewed up and rearranged and moved around. And I think that annotation's a big part of that, kind of that social aspect, but the idea that what we see a lot of is people taking a piece of content from the Pressbooks ecosystem and then rebuilding it, adding a new set of, we also integrate in addition with Hypothesis with H5P, which allows people to take something and build in new interactive content, quizzes, etc. And I just think that I'm gonna go back to what Mark said about the open standards, is that it's very exciting. I mean, I think most of us have been in this for a long time, long thinking about a ecosystem for information where it just is more fluid and flowable. But what's really exciting is that notion, or what's really important is that open standards make that possible in a way, and platforms that think about information as not something that is captured just in one place, in one closed system, but can flow out and be built upon and changed in different ways. And so that was a very rambly answer, but I think the idea that open standards should allow us to think about how we can take pieces of information and build and do different things with them, to me is just, I mean, it's driven a lot of the work that I've done, and it's exciting to see where Hypothesis is going. But I like getting into the actual bricks of the content itself and how can that be pulled apart and rebuilt. And that's an inherently social activity because you're taking something from somewhere else to rebuild it. So. Oh,
I couldn't agree with you more, Hugh. And that's really the space that's been the most interesting to me in recent years. And if you're here today on the session, there's definitely ways that you could participate. And we live increasingly in a distributed information environment, and I firmly believe that the future involves not only open standards, but open knowledge graphs, where publishers and librarians and individual researchers will be able to curate resources and annotate them with assertions. So it's going to be so important for trust and transparency and provenance as we move into really a more complex system. Dan, if folks are interested in joining the coalition, what's the best way for them to reach out?
They should ping either myself or you, and just drop an email and say, hey, and we'd love to tell you more about it. And this is not only for publishers, but also for institutions who are interested in how to ensure these kind of experiences across the content that they're licensing and connecting to on the behalf of their students and faculty.
And what if you're not super technical? Is there a role for you to play?
I mean, the goal of this is to make, great experiences for people, regardless of whether they're technical or not. So for sure, I think what we care most about is hearing what people need. It's not about whether they have a technical perspective or not.
Fantastic. Well, I want to thank our speakers collectively. It was an amazing tour through the world of social learning and all of the places that are touched by that. And we'll hand back over to Diane to close us off. I guess we're going to be able to stick around and continue to chat, but to close off the recorded version of the session.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Thanks, Heather. Thanks to all of our panelists. That was a really interesting, fascinating tour, as Heather said. I just dropped Dan's email in the chat, and it looks like other folks are sharing their emails as well. So please reach out if you're interested in getting more information about this project or joining the coalition. Let's see, Heather, I see your email address, but I think, did you mean to chat that out?
In the raw now, I'm going to chat it out to everyone.
Okay, cool. Thanks. All right. So yeah, I think we're going to go ahead and close down the recording of this session. Again, big thanks to our panelists and thank you so much to our attendees. If you'd like to hang around and have a chat with the panelists, please feel free to hang in there with us after we turn off the recording. Raise your hand, we can unmute you, and you can approach the podium and ask your questions or make your comments. And thanks so much for spending time with us here today. I hope to see you back at CNI in the weeks to come. Take care. Bye.